You've probably seen or heard people talk about learning from replays. And that can mean a couple of different things, but usually it is watching back a replay from something like HS Replay or the Deck Tracker, or even things like Firestone, I think has replays as well. So any of those kind of third-party tools, or it could be as simple as literally watching back a VOD. But however you are watching a replay, sometimes it can be easy to just gloss over the game and maybe not take away as much as you wanted to in terms of how to learn from that replay. So let's talk about some tips and strategies that you can use to get the most out of those replays. I want to start by talking about the kind of three main modes, I would say, of watching replays. And what do I mean by that? Well, the first is watching one of your own replays. The second is having somebody else watch one of your replays. And then the third is watching someone else's replay. Now, each of these kind of steps or each of these stages or ways of watching replays can have different effects on your learning and how you get something out of that replay. So, one thing when you are watching your own replay is if you can remember what your thought process was during that game, that helps a lot, especially if maybe you are working with somebody else to watch that replay of yours. If you can remember why you made the choices, or even what your thinking was when you had a discover option, or why did you play that minion, or why did you trade there instead of going face? If you can remember at least the logic that you had, you can explain your reasoning, and you get to look at the game from kind of a different perspective, even though it's still your own. So it's helpful to have that knowledge, but it's not always necessary. And sometimes maybe it's been a while since you've played, or you just really don't remember why you did certain things in that scenario. Or you can even trick yourself, and when you're looking at it in the replay, it's easy to come up with an explanation, but maybe during the game you actually didn't have that explanation, and that's okay. But those are helpful tools when you are reviewing one of your own replays, but if somebody else is maybe reviewing a replay without you there, or without you explaining your thoughts, or if you are watching somebody else's replay and you also don't have that player's thoughts, it can be a little bit tricky on kind of knowing what they were thinking in order to make the certain plays that they did. So, my biggest piece of advice, whether it's your own replay or having someone else watch, or you watching somebody else's, is take a step back from the emotional side of it. Don't even think about what might have been happening, what the thinking was. That will come later, but initially, you want to go into the replay by just purely looking at the plays and the potential thoughts, but really just the actions that were taken. Can you come up with a reason why plays were made? If you're watching your own replay, try not to think about you as the player. Try to think about that replay as if it was somebody else's instead of your own, and look at it very objectively. Would you make those same plays again? Would you advise somebody else to make those same plays? And maybe you're not at a level that you feel comfortable judging plays, or maybe you don't think that you have enough skill and you should be judging your plays. But with the knowledge that you have, just take that knowledge and look at the replay. Is there a reasoning for what happened? And without having all of the knowledge, was that play reasonable? Now, I do want to put an emphasis on that because sometimes this happens whether you are watching a stream, especially if it's like a broadcast for tournaments, and you might get to see both hands, or in some of the replays, you do get to see the cards face up that the opponent played later in the game. And people can kind of fall into a trap of saying, oh, of course, they had that. I shouldn't have played that here. But that really is a trap, because at the time you may have made a certain play, you wouldn't have known what was in their hand. So you do have to look at it very objectively and with that knowledge of not knowing what was in the hand, even though you can see it in the replay. Make sure that you aren't falling into traps like that, or even going the other way and making excuses for plays either. If there's not a good enough reason, if you can't explain why a play was made, and you just say, "Oh yeah, of course, it's because that happened," or the opponent had that card in hand that you can see in the replay. Being able to not even give a reason, whether it's a right or wrong reason, but not being able to have a reasoning for why a card was used can also lead you into a trap. And I feel like this is often most seen in replays. When you go back and look at these and you don't know why it was played, you just kind of make up a reason or you don't have a reason at all. So don't fall into those traps of looking at it after the fact. And this leads me to my last piece of advice, is to also remember that with replays, you have time. You have all the time to look at it, to break down a potential line of plays, break down a thought process for a discover option, or making a trade or not trade, or drawing and waiting for animations. Those things happen much, much faster in the game. Whereas when you're looking at a replay, you have the time to be able to analyze those. So again, going back to the same point that I just made, you can fall into the one of two traps, where looking at the time constraints of the game itself, when you're judging a replay and trying to look back and deciding if a play might have been good or bad, or whatever the case may be for whatever you're trying to look at in the replays, you don't want to judge yourself harshly on, "I can't believe I didn't see that play." Because sometimes when you're in the moment of the game, the rope might be burning, or maybe you had to wait what feels like forever for that animation to go off. You might not have seen the same thing as when you are looking back at a replay. It's a lot easier to see those things when you aren't in the heat of the moment. And on the other side of that, again, don't make excuses for it as well. Really go into replays as objectively as you can. And kind of in the same vein as the time, you have a lot of time to look at that replay. And if it was especially for something like a practice match or even a tournament match, and you're going back to review that VOD, those replays, don't do it immediately. It's really my biggest piece of advice. Take a little bit of time and kind of come back to it with fresh eyes. I was doing a coaching, I think a while back, with Language Hacker, and that was one huge thing that he advised was, kind of come back to it a little bit later. Don't look at it right afterwards, because especially if you lost, maybe you're a little bit salty about it, or maybe you just want to blame RNG. And looking at that replay is kind of like salt on the wound in some cases. So, looking back at it the next day, or having somebody else look at it the next day, maybe after you've had some rest, you've kind of gotten it off your mind directly, that's when you want to go look at those replays. And then you can analyze a little bit more objectively without also feeling all of those emotions that you just had during the match itself. And maybe you might see new things. Now, as always, I definitely suggest taking some sort of notes or writing something down that you feel is important. Notes seem like something for school or for kids, but if you really want to improve and you want to get better, this is such a valuable resource. It's so important to take notes because, especially when you're learning, sometimes you gotta, make the mistake like 3 or 4 times, maybe more. And it's helpful to have those notes written down and say, "Oh, here I didn't play the biggest minion from my hand, and the game ended when I had the opponent at just a little bit of health left. It might have gone differently if I had played the big minion instead." Or I was scared of removal, but I realized after watching the replay that my opponent was playing a deck that wasn't running that removal. I was playing scared during that game. Those are kind of the things that you really want to be looking at and taking notes on those replays while you are looking back at them. And everyone is going to look at the replays a little bit differently. Everyone's on different skill levels. So having somebody who maybe has a lot more experience on that deck that you've played review your replay, or reviewing somebody else who maybe hasn't gotten to the same levels that you have, and seeing what you can point out in those replays helps you too, because it's making you look objectively at those games, and it also makes you realize the things that you have learned before, instead of just harshly judging where you are at. Let me know in the comments below if you use replays often to look back at games. Are you reviewing those? And is there a certain thing that you look for when you are reviewing those games? I'd love to hear those, and hopefully those comments can help other people as well. So thank you so much for checking this video out. And for even more tips, tricks, strategies, check out this playlist here.